you see the wall-to-wall coverage when a white woman or a white girl goes missing. You don't ever see that really, that sort of statewide attention or nationwide attention. And I oftentimes think, it's part of that underlying dismissal of our existence sometimes, and a recognition of the pains that we experience as human beings. And I think it is time for us to speak up and take up space to make sure our lives matter in the ways in which others seem to.
Hey, GRIO fam, it's Gerren Keith Gaynor, White House correspondent and managing editor of politics at theGrio, and I'm here with Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. Congresswoman, welcome to theGrio. Pleasure to have you.
Yeah, great to be with you.
So it's CBC week, and you are introducing a really critical bill that addresses an issue that is important to many, and that is the issue of missing and murdered Black women and girls. Tell us about this bill and why it was so important for you to introduce this bill.
Yeah, thank you for having me to talk about this bill. We're dropping it today. Actually, we're introducing it hopefully with the whole Congressional Black Caucus as co-authors. But Representative Bonnie Watts Coleman and I thought it would be really important to introduce this legislation because, as you know, while African-American women and girls in my state make up 7% of the population, they represent 40% of the domestic violence victims in our state. And I think oftentimes we overlook the fact that a lot of law enforcement does not respond to these families when they are expressing concern about their missing daughters. And we think that it's going to be important to have this bill dedicated particularly to the memory of a Minnesotan, Brittany Clardy, and so many others in Minnesota who have become victims of crimes. And, I don't think of this as just a piece of legislation. I think of it as a beacon of hope for Black women and girls across the nation. By creating a dedicated office, we are not only going to address this alarming disparity in violence, but we're reaffirming our commitment to ensuring that every Black life is valued and protected.
And why do you believe that there's such an alarming and disproportionate number of Black women and girls either missing or murdered? What do you think is the underlying cause happening here?
Yeah, you see the wall-to-wall coverage when a white woman or a white girl goes missing. You don't ever see that really, that sort of statewide attention or nationwide attention. And I oftentimes think, it's part of that underlying dismissal of our existence sometimes, and a recognition of the pains that we experience as human beings. And I think it is time for us to speak up and take up space to make sure our lives matter in the ways in which others seem to.
And why is this particularly personal for you? You could have introduced a number of bills that are important to you this week. Why this one?
Well, it's personal to me, and it's obviously personal to so many advocates out there that have been working and uplifting this. Minnesota actually passed the legislation that we are introducing this year and has created an office just dedicated to doing this work. And we're trying to do that on a federal level because we think every state should have the ability to be able to do this. I'm a mother of two beautiful Black girls. I'm also a daughter. And I think, when you think about what representative democracy means, we want people who are out there fighting for that representation and trying to make sure that they are addressing the things that are not addressed.
And as you mentioned, this would create an office within the DOJ, and this is fashioned after a bill law in your state in Minnesota. What lessons can be learned from the success or challenges of the law in Minnesota that you can bring to DOJ? What should they be? What are the lessons to be learned there?
mean, there are incredible lessons to be learned. One is that organizing works, advocacy works. I want to shout out the legislative leaders that made that possible, our governor who signed it into law, but also all of the advocates who came out and championed this piece of legislation, spoke to the importance, who have also brought it to my attention to make sure that we were trying to do something federally. This is a homegrown legislation, and it's going to be really incredible to utilize all of those voices and the power of the Black Caucus, hopefully to get this legislation passed.
And you mentioned this is named after Brittany Clardy, a Black woman who was found dead many years ago in Minnesota. Could you tell us more about who Brittany Clardy was?
Yeah, Brittany was a young woman who, by all accounts, was a great student, was raised by her mom and dad, lived with her two siblings. She was an incredible young lady, and got herself caught up in some situations, and police were not as responsive to the calls of alarm from her mother, siblings, and dad when they said, she's missing. Police did not automatically investigate, and she was found in the trunk of her car almost 2 weeks later.
And you mentioned earlier about the role that law enforcement can play or not play in these situations. Do you see a connection when we talk about the larger conversation about racial bias and law enforcement when it comes to police brutality, for example? Do you see a connection here in those cases and how perhaps they are dismissive of missing or murdered Black women and girls because of racial bias that we often see entrenched in law enforcement agencies across the country?
Yes. I mean, you just spoke to it. There is a clear bias. The family of Brittany experienced it. There's so many other families that experience it. We also know, just anecdotally, oftentimes when you have serial killers who, kill Black women, they tend to get away with it a lot longer, because oftentimes those dots are not connected as easily. And so anecdotally, we know this. We also know that the numbers show it in data, and we want to make sure that this particular office that's being created serves as a hub for that data collection, for research. We also want further training to come out of this for law enforcement, and we also want there to be support to try to make sure our young girls and women are protected.
And what is your message to Black women and girls as it relates to keeping themselves safe? Because we know that, as this bill suggests, is that it is not necessarily a safe environment for Black women and girls.
Yeah, I mean, I want them to utilize every precaution. My young daughter, who's 11, the other day was like, "Mom, I want a pepper spray." We want young girls thinking about the dangers that are out there, and we want families talking to young girls and women, particularly Black girls, about the dangers that are out there and ways in which to be vigilant, to protect themselves, and to make sure that families themselves have the ability to advocate vigorously for themselves as well.
And lastly, it is Congressional Black Caucus's annual legislative conference, and we know that as CBC week, and so many things are happening as it relates to Black America and the global Black community. Could you just speak briefly to why CBC week is so important, and what are you looking forward to?
Oh my goodness. It is a really crucial week for Black people. Not only do you have people coming from all over the country to DC, but just the opportunity to share information, the opportunity to network, the opportunity to be able to connect with folks in your field that are doing research, that are working on policy, that are running for office, that are in elected office. There's just a lot of incredible stuff. And then there's the entertainment and all of the other things that go on. We in particular in our office are fortunate this year to have the foreign policy brain trust, and we will be doing it on Africa, and we'll be discussing a lot of the opportunities and challenges that exist for the continent and the ways in which our foreign policy can be moved towards partnership and in creating the prosperity of the continent.
Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, thank you again for your time.